Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas DeMoncho. I'm a professor of architecture and urban design here at Berkeley, director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and tonight we're very, very delighted to welcome Nnedi Okorafor and Donna Jones as part of our Art, Technology, and Culture lecture series. This lecture tonight is one of 3 in the ATC series that is a co-sponsored and co-build with a project I'm leading in the Berkeley College of Environmental Design for this entire academic year on the subject of science fiction and California's future. I'm going to briefly introduce this larger framing device to you. We've had several lectures so far this year in the series. We had Kim Stanley Robinson in the fall. We have Nnedi Okorafor today, and then I will be, April 26th, hosting a conversation about the past and future of spacesuits with the Mythbuster Adam Savage. Why are we doing this? Well, science fiction, I'm going to make the argument tonight, and Donna and Nnedi can agree or disagree when they get on stage, but I believe, as an immigrant to California, that science fiction is, in many ways, an unequivocally Californian phenomenon. Imagine futures, imagine galaxies, always actually California, and representing the galaxy of identities and possibilities contained within our great state. Now, sometimes this is obvious, but always, I would argue, it is just below the surface. In the visual tropes and spatial and infrastructural phenomena of California that follow us from the edge of the border and the edge of the continent to the edge between today and tomorrow. Now, this is most likely the case, as our first guest this semester, Kim Stanley Robinson, has noted, because California is already a science fictional place. The desert has been terraformed, he continues. The whole water system is unnatural and artificial. It shouldn't look like it looks. The places of California exist, most of all, at the scale of landscape and technology, a conundrum that defeats traditional architecture and even traditional urbanism. In this light, and this is very much the reason for our work this year, we also need to observe that the precarious balance between landscape, nature, and technology of which this state is made is today itself in a state of great danger. Ecological and technological transformations threaten California's cities and landscapes as never before, wildfires, sea level rise, and resulting groundwater flooding, adding to the omnipresent seismic hazards of the continental margin, let alone the larger political reality of which we are increasingly a part. Now, the studio is dedicated to the proposition made by the writer Michael Zeiser that science fiction may itself, therefore, be a very important way to think about the future of California. And this is the work that I and the graduate students and collaborators working with me are doing this semester. But we can't do this work alone. And this is in part why we have invited not just Nnedi, but all these amazing people to work with us on a set of products, the Studio One Manual for California's Future, that we will look forward to sharing with you by the end of the year. But I wanted to talk in particular about our lecture here tonight. There is no one visitor to our studio and to this series this semester that I am more excited about than Nnedi Okorafor. And I'll tell you why, because not only is her work amazing and astonishing, but what it represents in the larger landscape of science fiction and thinking about the future generally is, I believe, the most important thing that we will encounter all year. Most of you already know the amazing work of Nnedi Okorafor. She is herself amazing. She is actually Dr. Okorafor, holding a master's degree in journalism from Michigan State and a PhD in English from the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's also worked at the Clarion Writers Workshop in Lansing, Michigan. Her many, many well-known novels include Binti, Who Fears Death, Zara the Windseeker, and Akata Witch. She's the recipient of so many awards, but I will read out a couple. The Wole Soyinka Prize for Literature in Africa, the World Fantasy Award, the Nebula Award for Best Novella, the Hugo Award for Best Novella, the Macmillan Writers' Prize for Africa, the Carl Brandon Parallax Award, and the Children's Africana Book Award. I would like to explain why I care so much about Nnedi's work through the lens of a very small, but I think really wonderful piece of writing that she did only recently. The image that I showed in this presentation of the Death Star and the Apple headquarters is actually an illustration from a larger project of mine, which in part inspired this year's studio, a book about Apple and Star Wars and California and technology. The book is called Rebel Plans, and it's an attempt to think through the relationship between this landscape and technology and its influence on the world at large, but also what happens when so much of our culture and so much of the infrastructure of how we deal with each other goes through sometimes beautiful mechanisms, sometimes not so beautiful mechanisms, designed by a very few people from a very particular place, which is Northern California. One of the ways in which I talk about this is not only to compare the Death Star to the Apple headquarters, but also to note that the aesthetics of Apple products have in fact themselves transformed between the 1980s and the 2000s very precisely from the aesthetics of the Rebel Alliance to the aesthetics of the Empire, from modular, open, bashed together rectangles to perfectly sleek, perfectly finished slabs of black and glass and shininess. And in a way, if you think about this, you can think about it also through architecture and through the way in which, while we never see the entire limit of the galactic empire, the perfection and control that the empire has over the galaxy is expressed entirely through architectural detail, through the way in which on the Death Star everything fits, everything works together. And the narrative of especially the first movie, is a narrative of the sort of disorder and openness of a small group of people, the Han and Leia and Luke and the droids, navigating that space and messing it up just a little bit, but in just the right way. I think this is an important narrative. I already thought it was an important narrative because cities are increasingly dominated by technological infrastructure, and that technological infrastructure increasingly is designed without imagining difference and alternatives and adaptation and messiness, and is designed with a kind of vision of precision and control that would be familiar to the empire as it would be unfamiliar and unhospitable and uninhabitable to every rebel, every person of color, every person who doesn't fit in to whatever perfectionist utopia is driving the vision of that technology to begin with. This is a long-winded introduction, but imagine my complete and absolute mind-splitting delight when I discovered a very short story that Nnedi wrote called Baptist, which tells the story of the entire galaxy of Star Wars from the perspective not of the rebels themselves, not even of the most transgressive liminal space they occupy in the Death Star, which is the trash compactor, but very precisely from the perspective of the creature in the trash compactor, who of course is entirely aware, who has the name Omi, the Yoruba word for water, and is entirely aware, in fact, of her masterful and central and, mind you, unrecognized and unlauded role in the whole drama. To me, it is a really beautiful and wonderful vision of the necessary importance of encountering and engaging difference in any city and in any vision of the future. And so that is my particular delight in welcoming Nnedi here tonight. And Nnedi will be joined on stage by my incredibly valued colleague, Donna Jones, professor of English. She is the author of many works, including the book Rachel Discourses of Life Philosophy, Negritude, Vitalism, and Modernity. She's currently working on books including The Ambiguous Promise of European Decline, Race and Historical Pessimism in the Era of the Great War, and The Tribunal of Life, Reflections on Vitalism, Race, and Biopolitics. It is in regard to this second theme of research that she also teaches a survey and a course on science fiction in the English department, particularly around questions of life and related to technology as they are expressed in the world and through science fiction in particular. So we're just so fortunate to have both these amazing women with us tonight and to hear them in conversation together. They will have a conversation together to begin with, and then I will join them to help filter and sequence the questions that you are all contributing on index cards that the ushers will bring up to the front and help join the conversation. If a question occurs to you and you don't have an index card, just raise your hand and someone will bring one to you along with a pen. And we will keep going like that as long as we have the stamina. And then Nnedi will also grace all of us with a book signing afterwards outside, where you can buy her amazing books as well. So join me in a round of applause after that overlong introduction for Nnedi Okorafor and Donna Jones.
Good evening, everyone. Let me get this ready. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I love any talk of the Baptist. I had so much fun writing that. That was such a surprise. That was one of those stories where Lucasfilms just suddenly appeared in my inbox one day, which was very cool. And they were doing an anthology, a 40th year anthology, which featured short stories, 40 short stories from A New Hope. And so they had all kinds of 40 different writers who were writing stories and you had to write either a story, basically a story that was about a non-major character in Star Wars. And for me, of course, the first thing that popped into my head were creatures. I'm always interested in creatures and their point of view and how they experience the world. So that story was a real surprise because one, I was the one who chose to do that. I actually wanted to write 3 stories. I wanted to write 3 short vignettes, one on the trash compactor monster, then one on I think it was called the Sarlacc, that the creature from Return of the Jedi, and then one from the point of view of the worm on the asteroid. And so those were like all in different Star Warses. So when they said A New Hope, then I just focused it on the trash compactor monster, because I thought that monster deserved a story and a name. So, but yeah, today I'm going to read from Binti, and the Binti series is very special to me. The inspiration there were so many parts of that so many aspects that inspired this story, and I'm gonna talk about them very quickly because they're all from different points of view, because it just came to me in many different ways. One of them was I went to the United Arab Emirates, and I spent some time in Sharjah, which is like right next to Dubai. And one of the things that struck me was something that tends to strike me in certain parts of the world, and it was the blending of the ancient and the modern. Like you had these old traditions with the modern, and those two things kind of coexisting comfortably. And that was one of the biggest things that got me interested, and I knew I wanted to write something set in a world like that. The second thing was I saw a jellyfish. I saw a jellyfish, and for me, I've seen them in aquariums and all of that, fine. But that was the first jellyfish that I saw that was alive in the wild, and it was just I looked into I think it was called the Khalifa Lagoon It was super hot that day. I was with my daughter. My daughter and I love the heat. We love it. And it was like 105 or something that day. And so we were outside. We were like, oh yeah, let's go outside and just be like, in the sun. And we were out there, and basically everyone disappeared. Except my daughter and I. So we were out there alone. Everyone basically took cover, but we loved that. So we were out there, and I just remember we looked into the lagoon, and that's when I saw this blue jellyfish just pumping away, and it was the first time I'd seen a jellyfish alive. I'd seen one in Trinidad, but it was dead. It was a man of war. So that one doesn't count. So there was something about that moment that just really, it was a poignant moment for me. And so I felt that in this story that this jellyfish needed to be immortalized. And I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, that jellyfish was immortalized in the Binti series. And then lastly, Binti is, and I'm going to read a bit, and you'll see where I'm coming with this and where this inspiration comes in. It's very clear. I come from a very insular Nigerian American family. And we're in Chicago, and my sisters and my brother and my mom were all in Chicago. My dad has passed, and he was in Chicago. Nobody leaves. Everyone stays in this area. And to leave, like there's this feeling that if any of us moves away, that we're destroying the family. And at some point, I was a professor at Chicago State University, and I hated it there. And the University at Buffalo kind of dropped out of the sky one day and made this offer for this position. They created a position for me, and it was tenured, and it was twice as much pay, teaching half as many classes. It was just an offer I couldn't refuse. And so I took the offer. And when I went and I took this position, so I moved basically to Buffalo, even though I kept my condo in Chicago. I moved to Buffalo, and my family was not happy with this at all. They were, basically I was disowned for like a year. And so I'm very close with my family. So that was really jarring for me. And so that August, when I got to Buffalo, I'm there, and all I'm thinking is, that it was like leaving my planet. And then I started thinking about, what if I made a mistake? So for me, writing has always been a very therapeutic thing, and that's what made me start writing Binti, and you'll see where a lot of that works its way in. So I'm going to start right at the beginning so I don't have to explain much, and then I'm going to jump and read a little bit into the story. So this is just the very beginning. This is pretty short. Oh, and the image is behind you. Okay, so we know what that is. That's Binti. That's the book. Okay, and so that image there, Binti, our main character, she's Himba, and this young woman here is Himba. They are an ethnic group from Namibia, and that's another inspiration behind my character. The Himba cover themselves with what's called ojitse, which is kind of a blend of clay, ochre, and oil and perfumes, and they cover their skin with it, and they roll their hair with it as well. It's part of their tradition. It's also part of their culture, but it's also a beauty thing as well. So in Binti, this story takes place in the far future. So that implies that we have an African culture that the people have kept into the future, well into the future. And that was something that I wanted to see. I wanted to see the practices of the Himba people in the future. That was very important to me. All right, now I'll read. Okay, so this is chapter 1. I powered up the transporter and said a silent prayer. I had no idea what I was going to do if it didn't work. My transporter was cheap, so even a droplet of moisture, or more likely a grain of sand, would cause it to short. It was faulty, and most of the time I had to restart it over and over before it worked. Please not now, I thought. The transporter shivered in the sand, and I held my breath. Tiny, flat, and black as a prayer stone, it buzzed softly and then slowly rose from the sand. Finally, it produced the baggage-lifting force. I grinned. Now I could make it to the shuttle. I swiped Ojitse from my forehead with my index finger and knelt down. Then I touched the finger to the sand, grounding the sweet-smelling red clay into it. "Thank you," I whispered. It was a half-mile walk along the dark desert road. With the transporter working, I would make it there on time. Straightening up, I paused and shut my eyes. Now the weight of my entire life was pressing on my shoulders. I was defying the most traditional part of myself for the first time in my entire life. I was leaving in the dead of night, and they had no clue. My 9 siblings, all older than me except for my younger sister and brother, would never see this coming. My parents would never imagine I'd do such a thing in a million years. By the time they all realized what I'd done and where I was going, I'd have left the planet. In my absence, my parents would growl to each other that I was never to set foot in their home again. My 4 aunties and 2 uncles who lived down the road would shout and gossip amongst themselves about how I'd scandalized our entire bloodline. I was going to be a pariah. "Go," I softly whispered to the transporter, stamping my foot. The thin metal rings I wore around each ankle jingled noisily, but I stamped my foot again. Once on, the transporter worked best when I didn't touch it. "Go," I said again, sweat forming on my brow. When nothing moved, I chanced giving the 2 large suitcases sitting atop the force field a shove. They moved smoothly, and I breathed a sigh of relief. At least some luck was on my side. So Binti is a mathematical genius who has secretly applied and then been accepted into the finest university in the galaxy. And she's just snuck away from her very traditional family, where she has her life mapped out for her. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit. And at this point, Binti, our main character, and by the way, her name means girl in Arabic. And I got that from when I was in Sharjah. I spoke at several traditional schools, and at one of these schools, the girls kept when I was talking, the teacher had to keep stopping and yelling at the girls to straighten their veils, and so they would straighten them, and then a few minutes later, the teacher would stop and yell at them again, and she kept calling them bint, 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 and I suspect the girls were doing it on purpose just to piss off their teacher, but. So bint means girl in Arabic, but and that was the original name of this story. But then there was my editor was like, "Oh, bint in certain parts of the UK has a different meaning." That was problematic, and we could have a whole conversation about that. So I ended up changing it to Binti, which is Kiswahili with the same meaning. So that's where that comes from. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little forward. So Binti has left. She has snuck away from this very set life. She's a mathematical genius, and she's expected to succeed her father. And she just wanted more. She felt like going to this school, which happens to be 2%. Only 2% human, which means aliens. She wants to go to this school and see where that takes her, and also so she's on her way, having the time of her life, meeting people who are of a different culture than she is. She's the only Himba individual on this ship. No Himba has ever gone to this university, and this university is an entire planet, by the way. And so she's meeting like minds, and she's making friends, and she has this object with her that she found in the desert long ago. I think she was 8 years old when she found it. It's either 8 or 11. I always get it mixed up. But when you write stuff, you pull it out of your head, and it's no longer in your head. But so she found this object. She's 16 now. And she found this object in the desert. The desert was where she would go to think, where she'd go just to be alone, and it was just a place that she loved going to. And one day she found this object, and an Adan is like it's a useless object. It's a useless bit of old technology that nobody knows what it is anymore. And so she's had this Adan for years, and it's kind of like a luck charm to her, and she just keeps it with her just because. So she has it when she's on the ship in this scene, and she's just kind of fumbling with it in her hand. So I'll continue from there. Okay. Then there was Jeru. I had never spoken to him, but we smiled across the table at each other during meal times. This is on the ship. He was from one of those cities so far from mine that they seemed like a figment of my imagination, where there was snow and where men rode those enormous gray birds and the women could speak to those birds without moving their mouths. Once Jeru was standing behind me in the dinner line with one of his friends. I felt someone pick up one of my locks and I whirled around ready to be angry. I met his eyes and he quickly let go of my hair, smiled and raised his hand up defensively. I couldn't help it, he said, his fingertips reddish with my ojitse. You can't control yourself, I snapped. You have exactly 21, he said, and they're braided in tessellating triangles. Is it some sort of code? I wanted to tell him that there was a code, that the pattern spoke of my family's bloodline, culture, and history. That my father had designed the code and my mother and aunties had shown me how to braid it into my hair. However, looking at Jeru, it made my heart beat too fast and my words escaped me, so I merely shrugged and turned around to pick up a bowl of soup. Jeru was tall and had the whitest teeth I'd ever seen. And he was very good in mathematics. Few would have noticed the code in my hair. But I never got the chance to tell him that my hair was braided into the history of my people. Because what happened, happened. It occurred on the 18th day of the journey, the 5 days before we arrived on the planet Umzayuni, the most powerful and innovative sprawling university in the Milky Way. I was the happiest I had ever been in my life, and I was farther from my beloved family than I'd ever been in my life. I was at the table savoring a mouthful of gelatinous, milk-based dessert with slivers of coconut in it. I was gazing at Jeru, who wasn't gazing at me. I put my fork down and had my Adan in my hands. I fiddled with it as I watched Jeru talk to the boy beside him. The delicious creamy dessert was melting coolly on my tongue. Beside me, Olu and Remy were singing a traditional song from their city because they missed home, a song that had to be sung with a wavery voice like a water spirit. Then someone screamed, and Jeru's chest burst open and splattered me with his warm blood. There was a Medusa right behind him. In my culture, it is blasphemy to pray to inanimate objects, but I did anyway. I prayed to a metal even my father had been unable to identify. I held it to my chest, shut my eyes, and I prayed to it. I am in your protection, please protect me. I am in your protection, please protect me. My body was shuddering so hard that I can imagine what it would be like to die from terror. I held my breath, the stench of them still in my nasal cavity and mouth. Jeru's blood was on my face, wet and thick. I prayed to the mystery metal my Adan was made of, because that had to be the only thing keeping me alive at this moment. Breathing hard from my mouth, I peeked from one eye. I shut it again. The Medusa were hovering less than a foot away. One had launched itself at me, but then froze an inch from my flesh. It had reached a tentacle towards my Adan and then suddenly collapsed, the tentacle turning ash gray as it quickly dried up like a dead leaf. I could hear the others, their near substantial bodies softly rustling as their transparent domes filled with and released the gas they breathed back in. They were tall as grown men, their domes flesh thin as fine silk, their long tentacles spilling down to the ground like a series of gigantic ghostly noodles. I grasped my Adan closer to me. I am in your protection, please protect me. Everyone in the dining hall was dead. I'll stop there. Thank you. Now, I'm not sure how much time I have. How much time do I have? Do I have 15? 50? Oh, to read though? Or should I read? Okay, another 10 minutes? Good? Okay. All right, I'm gonna switch gears then. And now I'm gonna read something lighter from Who Fears Death? I have never done these two backwards. Oh gosh. Okay. All right. Who Fears Death? Okay. Oh Lord. I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning, and it's not lighter. It's not lighter. So Who Fears Death? I wish I had an image to put up. Who Fears Death is my third novel. It is still. Yeah, it's still my darkest novel, and this is the one that was optioned by HBO to be developed into a TV series. And I guess I could. Let me just read it. Because if I start talking about the inspiration behind this, it just gets it's harder to read. There was the inspiration behind this was very heavy. It was a passing of my father, so yeah. Okay, so this is chapter 1, Becoming. My father's face. My life fell apart when I was 16. Papa died. He had such a strong heart, yet he died. Was it the heat and smoke from his blacksmithing shop? It's true that nothing could take him from his work, his art. He loved to make the metal bend and obey him, but his work only seemed to strengthen him. He was so happy in his shop. So what was it that killed him? To this day, I can't be sure. I hope it had nothing to do with me or what I did back then. Immediately after he died, my mother came running out of their bedroom, sobbing and throwing herself against the wall. I knew then that I would be different. I knew in that moment that I would never again be able to fully control the fire inside me. I became a different creature that day, not so human. Everything that happened later, I now understand, started then. The ceremony was held on the outskirt of town, before the sand dunes. It was the middle of the day and terribly hot. His body lay on a thick white cloth surrounded by a garland of braided palm fronds. I knelt there in the sand before his body, saying my last goodbye. I'll never forget his face. It didn't look like Papa's anymore. Papa's skin was dark brown, his lips were full. This face had sunken cheeks, deflated lips, and skin like gray-brown paper. Papa's spirit had gone elsewhere. The back of my neck prickled. My white veil was a poor protection from people's ignorant and fearful eyes. By this time, everyone was always watching me. I clenched my jaw. Around me, women were on their knees, weeping and wailing. Papa was dearly loved, despite the fact that he'd married my mother, a woman with a daughter like me, an Ewu daughter. That had long been excused as one of those mistakes even the greatest man can make. Over the wailing, I heard my mother's soft whimper. She had suffered the greatest loss. It was her turn to have her moment. Afterwards, they'd take him for cremation. I looked down at his face one last time. I'll never see you again, I thought. I wasn't ready. I blinked and touched my chest. That's when it happened, when I touched my chest. At first it felt like an itchy tingle, and it quickly swelled into something more. The more I tried to get up, the more intense it got, and the more my grief expanded. They can't take him, I thought frantically. There's still so much metal left in his shop. He hasn't finished his work. The sensation spread through my chest and radiated out of the rest of my body, and I rounded my shoulders to hold it in, and then I started pulling it from people around me. I shuddered and gnashed my teeth. I was filling with rage. Oh, not here, I thought, not at Papa's ceremony. Life wouldn't leave me alone long enough to even mourn my dead father. Behind me, the wailing stopped. All I heard was a gentle breeze. It was utterly eerie. Something was beneath me, in the ground or maybe somewhere else. Suddenly, I was slammed with the pained emotions of everyone around me. For Papa. On instinct, I laid my hand on his arm. People started screaming. I didn't turn around. I was too focused on what I had to do. Nobody tried to pull me away. No one touched me. My friend Louis's uncle was once struck by lightning during a rare dry season Ungwa storm. He survived, but he couldn't stop talking about how it felt like being violently shaken from the inside out. That's how I felt now. I gasped with horror. I couldn't take my hand from Papa's arm. It was fused to him. My sand-colored skin tapered to his gray-brown skin from my palm, a mound of mingled flesh. I started screaming. It caught in my throat and I coughed, and then I stared. Papa's chest was slowly moving, up and down, up and down. He was breathing. I was both repulsed and desperately hopeful. I took a deep breath and cried, "Live, Papa, live!" A pair of hands settled on my wrists. I knew exactly whose they were. One of his fingers was broken and bandaged, and if he didn't get his hands off me, I'd hurt him far worse than I had 5 days prior. "Onye Sonwu," Aro said into my ear, quickly taking his hands from my wrists. Oh, how I hated him. But I listened. "He's gone," he said. "Let go so we can all be free of it." Somehow, I did. I let go of Papa. Everything went dead silent again, as if the world for a moment were submerged in water. Then the power that had built up inside me burst. My veil was blown off my head, and my freed braids whipped back. Everyone and everything was thrown back. Aro, my mother, family, friends, acquaintances, strangers, the table of food, the 50 yams, the 30 large monkey bread fruits, the 5 cows, the 10 goats, the 30 hens, and so much sand. Back in town, the power went off for 30 seconds. Houses would need to be swept of sand, and computers would be taken in for dust damage. That underwater-like silence again. I looked down at my hand, and when I tried to remove it from Papa's cold, still dead arm, there was a sound of peeling, like weak glue flaking off. My hand left a silhouette of dried mucus on Papa's arm. I rubbed my fingers together, and more of the stuff crackled and peeled from between them. I took one look at Papa, and then I fell over to the side and passed out. That was 4 years ago. Now see me. People here thought I caused it all. They want to see my blood, they want to make me suffer, then they want to kill me. Whatever happens after this, let me stop. Tonight you want to know how I came to be what I am. You want to know how I got here. It's a long story, but I'll tell you. You're a fool if you believe what others say about me. I tell you my story to avert all those lies. Thankfully, even my long story will fit on that laptop of yours. I have 2 days. I hope it's enough time. It will all catch up with me soon. My mother named me Onye Sonwu. It means who fears death. She named me well. I was born 20 years ago during troubled times, and ironically, I grew up far from all the killing. Thank you. Whew. All right.
Thank you for that wonderful reading from these 2 works. I think I'll begin the conversation, or actually just kind of picking up off the work, because I kind of want to, definitely want to pull that ether in to our conversation. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, particularly with Binti and Who Fears Death. There are two works that, so many of your works naturally, that feature very strong female protagonists who have to make choices, I think really, really strong and deliberate choices about cultures and about their own culture, right? That are difficult choices, taking up certain, or I guess like encountering certain, elements of tradition that are harmful to them even, right? Or that they have, or feel ambiguous about. I know that in a sense, having read both Binti and Who Fears Death, this is a sort of prelude. And it's, of course, with Binti, with her leaving her family behind, right? Making that deliberate choice, going off to university. And but I was just wondering if you could talk about that, because it's just, I found that this is a persistent thing that it's really, really fascinating. You deal with it so wonderfully.
Thank you. I think even from the first book that I wrote, which was Zara the Windseeker, there's always been something in me that drives to tell these stories of resisting patriarchy. I think a lot of that has to do with just one of my, even before I was writing, it's been something that I have been pushing back against, for a long time. And it's something that I have observed and been frustrated by and angered by and just sought to destroy. Just to be blunt about it.
Smashing the patriarchy.
It definitely, and it's not like, it's not that I sat down to write stories where that's what I was going to do, but these just came up. These are things that I've been concerned with for so long. And so when I sit down to write, writing is a very personal thing. You are digging deep within yourself. And those things naturally found their way in my story. So like even with Zara the Windseeker, like one of the things that I was imagining when I was writing this, this whimsical tale of this girl, and I also tend to write a lot about women and girls who leave.
Yeah.
That's like something. Yeah. And so in Zara the Windseeker, she leaves. It's about a girl who leaves and goes into a dangerous forest to get something. Like that is what the plot is. And I remember when I was, even before I wrote it, I was looking at my female cousins whenever we would visit Nigeria, and I would watch my female cousins and I watch my male cousins, and I would watch the difference in how they were treated. Like my male cousins they always had time to hang with us, like my sisters and I. They finish their homework and then go play video games or hang with us. My female cousins would finish their homework and then have all these chores. They'd have to wash the dishes, they'd have to do the laundry. They just always, and sometimes clean up after their male cousins. And that always bugged me. And so I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I wrote something that was so good that they would hide and not do their chores, So that was like early on. These are things that kind of were driving me, and so and then in writing these strong, and I've always been really concerned with I wanted to see these not just strong female characters, but complex, flawed, and interesting female characters. That's something that I want to read. That's something that I felt, for me, I was lacking a lot of that. And I was always really concerned with filling in gaps as well. So it comes from a lot of different places.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, because what I also enjoy is that it's not Pollyanna-ish. They're leaving, but they have to navigate some very, their own investments as well. Like one of the things I love about Binti is it's like crazy point where I shouldn't. There's spoilers. Okay,
I spoiled a lot of it even in my reading.
But when the Medusa are they're kind of replacing her hair.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a huge and very powerful section of the novel, right? So these women having to kind of negotiate and navigate these very, very powerful choices, right?
And there are consequences.
Yeah.
There are consequences that are often irreversible, and you have to decide: are you still going to go forward, even if this, like with Binti and the whole thing with where her hair is basically replaced with tentacles. Genetically, her genetics shifts,
Right.
and it does that multiple times in the trilogy. And there's no going back.
Yeah.
There's no going back, and there's something like it's like I remember when I was writing that, how final that felt, and it was disturbing to write, but it was like that's how a lot of these choices are. You in order to get to where you need to go, there are consequences to that, and there's no going back, and you are forever changed, and you have to live with that. And that's also what for Binti is part of growing up as well. So it's a lot of, there are a lot of things that I was facing.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. Another thing I was going to ask you, and this is somewhat like slightly frivolous, but Binti's kind of like a university novel too.
Yes, it is.
So I just love the idea of the planetary university.
Yes.
Right. So you could talk about. I mean,
Universities are planets. They're planets in themselves. Even the name university, but they're planets in themselves. They have all these working parts. It's like, I've been a student. I have bachelor's and 2 masters and PhD. So I've dwelled in the university for a large part of my life, and then been a professor. Yeah. That's of course going to find its way into my work. But like this idea of Umziyuni, the planet that is, it makes complete sense to me. Yeah. It makes complete sense to me.
No, I have to say that was a major selling point of the novel for me. I just thought, finally, a science fiction novel that is also a university novel. Yes, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
No, wonderful. And also, I was going to say, since because Nicholas brought up, the occasion for this is also, California and science fiction, right? And which makes us think about place, right? The importance of place in science fiction. So much of science fiction, we think about this in terms of like world building, right? And then it's like kind of a, kind of you pull the world out of the ether or something of the sort. But, place is so important. And so I was going to ask you about place in your fiction. And naturally, of course, in Nigeria. But also just, places, really. So how does that, function? How does that work? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. It's like, first, for me, when I'm writing, it always starts with the character. The character comes to me first, strongly. I'm the type of writer, and I know this makes writers sound crazy, but I hear voices. I hear my characters speak to me. And some of them are mean. Onisomu was mean. Phoenix was mean. Binti was nice.
Dickens famously spoke to his characters all the time.
Exactly. So they come to me very strong. But once I have the character, the character has to be set in a place. And I am all about that. Like I have to be able to not just be inside the head of my character, but look around. That's really important. I get it. And when I look around, I have to be able to see, touch, smell, hear. Like those details are very necessary for me to even write the story. So place is really important. It's also like, I haven't written a story that's set in a cold place. I don't like the cold.
Okay,
you won't see me writing about any snowy place. You just won't.
Like, Shackleton stories.
No.
Right? Okay, all right.
No,
So,
and it's because I don't want to be there. It's really what it is. I don't want to be there. But like, I like deserts. I like deserts, and you see deserts show up a lot in my work. But the place is often part of the story as well. I like to there's multiple moments with where in my stories where I look around and I like to stop and just look around and take it all in and just enjoy that. That's really it's not just for the sake of telling the story. I just love doing that too. So I like to. Okay, this is an aside. I'm just going to go off on tangent because I feel like it.
Okay,
so,
you can,
video games, okay? My favorite types of video games were the kind of video games where I could walk around, where I could move away. Like Myst.
Yeah,
Myst was my favorite video game.
That's the only one I played.
Yeah, exactly. And that whole series, because you could just step off the path of this is what you have to do. You can step off the path and go and just meander about and whatever. So those are the kinds of, that's just kind of how my imagination works as well. I like to be able to not just focus on the plot, but be able to dwell in that world. Yeah. And to dwell in the world, it has to be real. It has to be like right down to how the grass feels, what jumps up from the grass when you touch the grass. So those details are extremely important to me.
Cool. So what's your favorite place to write about? I mean, outside of the desert, well, actually, I'll just ask you. So Lagoon, Lagos.
God,
because, again, these, what I also, I'll let you.
Lagoon. Lagoon. Okay, so Lagoon is the easiest way to describe Lagoon is aliens invading Lagos, Nigeria, right? And Lagos, Nigeria. Okay, so Lagos is the biggest city in Africa, and it's a city that I have been going to since I was in my teens. Typically, when I was younger, the place we would go straight to was Port Harcourt, and then the south. We were always in the southeast, and then we started first stopping in Lagos. My first time in Lagos, I hated it. It was literally, and I describe it like this because it's true. It was New York on crack. Like, it was too much. I mean, like, literally from the moment we got there, we arrived at the airport, we left the airport. First of all, leaving the airport is just an interesting experience because you walk out and sometimes it's night and there's just this crowd of people there just looking to see. I don't know what they're looking for. I don't know. But it's like, you're just wondering, what is everyone here for? And I hope it's not me. So that's how it starts. So you get there and it was about a 20-minute drive to the hotel. By the time we got to the hotel, I'd seen so many things that I was at the bottom of the car. I was like scrunched all the way at the bottom of the car saying, I want to get the hell out of here. This place is people, everyone here is crazy. It was just the traffic, the energy. High energy. The place is just vibrant. It is full of life and death and all kinds of things. So that was my first experience with Lagos. And in that time that I was there, I refused to cross the street. I'm like, I'm not crossing a street because I don't want to die. That's how intense Lagos was. But so much happens there. There's just so much, right? So this was before I was writing. So by the time I started writing, I knew at some point I was going to write about Lagos. Like, as a writer, you look for the conflict and you look for the energy. Man, what better place than that city? Yeah. That city. It's old. It's new. It is the African future, and but at the time when I was there, I didn't see it as that. It was just that was something that slowly kind of descended on me the more times I went. It was very futuristic, very, and so when I started thinking about the film District 9, which I had all kinds of problems with, that's a whole lecture in itself.
Oh, okay.
But I had all kinds of problems with it, but it started making me think about, especially because of its very negative, problematic portrayal of Nigerians, I started thinking about, well, what would it be like if aliens came to Nigeria? And then that was an easy, like, it practically wrote itself. I'm like, oh, they'd go to Lagos. That's the first place they'd go. And, the rest practically wrote itself.
Sidetrack. Not to Joburg. Straight to Lagos. No. And I concur. And thinking as well as in terms of a lot of visual arts and a lot of kind of urban theory. I mean, Lagos is a particular futuristic. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say problem, but like a kind of a conundrum. Like, where do we build from here on the city that's everything is built on top of it?
Yes.
And you've got the water and you've got all of these, environments, and you've got, it's just this hyperdrive of an urban environment. Yes. So I think that, the futuristic aspects of it are really, really fascinating. And Lagoon, I think you get, I as a New Yorker, I truthfully, I really, I appreciated that a great deal. I like that novel. I like it a whole lot.
That one was a lot of fun to write. I was able to just pull in so much.
Good.
Lagoon.
Good. Great. Yeah, no. Okay, so place, now I was going to think about technology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think one of the things that I really enjoy, and I read, it's somewhere, and again, I'm really kind of fuzzy with sites right now, but somewhere I think you talked about like nature and technology, or you made some reference to it, and it's in your work. I mean, one of the things I'm pulling from it is that it also sounds like something you would say precisely because so much of your work really involves this kind of synthetic or symbiotic relationship between sort of creatures, nature, organisms, and technology. The question I'm asking is like, one, how do you come to that in your work? Where does that come from? And then I guess the second half of the question would be, what would things I've always wanted to ask sci-fi writers. Well, what would tech look like for you? Yes. Let's design some stuff.
Yes. I think that first of all, it's all, pun intended, it's all very organic. So there are multiple things. I'm going to try to hold this in my head. One, I'm of the belief that the greatest technology is nature, like the greatest. There's no greater technology that human beings could create without the help of nature. And I'm also of the belief that if we move with nature, we'll move faster than if we move against it. So that's always been like the core of it. So for example, looking at, let's say someone needs to walk. Someone has difficulty walking and they need to walk. There's one way to help the person walk using technology would be prosthetics, right? Or exoskeletons, which kind of augment your ability to walk. So there's that, which is something that I love, and I'm really interested in that. There's also the ability, or there's also looking at the idea of looking at the mechanism of walking and the nervous system and the muscles and all of that, and then applying human technology to that and moving in that direction. So that's where that whole idea of organic tech comes from me. If I'm looking at the future, at future technology, organic tech is what I'm looking at. What I'm really, really interested in. Just the idea of the materials not being metal, but being organic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Frankly, I'm just hoping we can all be like salamanders.
Cool. I can dig that. I can dig that. Salamanders are awesome.
No, I want to make sure that we have time for the audience. But the couple of questions, the two that I really, really want to get in. One, I wanted to ask you about a little bit about the Book of the Phoenix, because it's. I guess you wrote that in 2015. I think
so. Yeah.
And and your books, they range. What I love about them is that they move from so many different, kind of classic sci-fi forms. From the Binti, this incredible trilogy. Who Fears Death, which is this kind of desolate world, and then this one seemed to be the most kind of historical and the most political of them. I think you dedicated even to the Stolen Girls at book. Yeah. So what went into writing that?
Yeah, so much. So the Book of Phoenix, I can't remember what number book that was. It's funny that I could say that, but I can't remember what number book that was. It's the inspiration was thinking about Who Fears Death and thinking about the world of Who Fears Death and how it became desert, how the earth became desert. And I was curious. I was like, okay, how did this occur? And there's a story within Who Fears Death that talks about, it's kind of like, it talks about what happened. It implies nuclear, something, some kind of powerful force was applied to the earth that changed it. And it's written as a legend. so the hints are in there,
Yeah,
right? So that's where, and so I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about what caused this huge shift in the earth, and that led me down some dark roads, because at the time when I wrote the Book of Phoenix, that was when I was teaching at Chicago State, and I was really angry. I was really angry. I just was not enjoying myself, and I was envisioning just blowing the place up constantly. This fire and destruction and all of that. So I like to channel my energy. So I channeled it into my work. And the Book of Phoenix went on to be, I would say it's my most political book. It's also my blackest book. I will say that. It's blackety black. That book is blackety black. It's very much about Africans and people of African descent. It's about the diaspora. It's just, I was dabbling in some things with that one. And there are days where I can't believe it was published. I got away with it. But yeah, so the inspiration from that was trying to see what happened, but also I started thinking about experimentation on human beings. I started thinking about the Tuskegee trials, and I started thinking about slavery, and I started thinking about a lot of things. And then I looked into the future while I was thinking about those things, and that's where really the Book of Phoenix came from. It's very much it's a worldwide narrative, that one. Yeah.
Well, onto cheerier things. The last question I was no. So okay. Now this is another note to self, that questions I've always wanted to ask favorite sci-fi writers. So yes. Films. We all know the relationship between science fiction, literature, and cinema. What is missing? What needs to be adapted to film, like immediately, pronto? You're sitting here, you bankroll it, it's just going to happen. What's going to?
Oh God, that's geez, that's a heavy question. Gosh.
I know that was mean.
Film. Well, of course, there's everything that Octavia Butler has written.
Of course.
Everything.
Yeah.
Let's see. I would like to see, and this is, I'm not going to call it remote, but I would like to see some of the African novels adapted. I would love to see something like Famished Road adapted. That would be nuts.
Yeah. Or My Life in the Bush of Ghosts.
Yes. Oh Lord.
No, I mean,
that would be fantastic. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Adapted in the right way.
Absolutely.
Oh my God, like The Palm Wine Drinker. That would be great. I would love to see. I would love to see that. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, but we'll leave it at that. Those ones, yeah.
Okay.
But there's more, of course.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Good question.
No.
And for Donna. I'm going to open up the conversation to include all of you, and I will not be able to ask every single amazing question that you guys just produced, but I will do my best. You said that you wanted to be a writer, but why did you start writing fantasy and science fiction, or science fiction in particular, and do you distinguish between those two, and how? If I did that justice.
Yeah, that was good. I didn't start writing fantasy. It started it just happened. It was like, because the first few things that I wrote, the first things that I wrote were fantastical, even though like I take issue with like even the labeling of fantasy because I don't think it includes enough. That's why I've been calling my work African Jujuism. That's right. There's a reason behind that because that African Jujuism by my definition, because there is no other, it deals with fantasy, the fantastical things, the made up things, but it also makes room for those things that I have not made up that are culturally specific and that deal with cosmologies that people actually believe in that are blended in with the fantasy. So that's a different type of work, and that needs to be acknowledged. I've always felt that needs to be acknowledged because when that is acknowledged, those works are read in that way, with an understanding. So back to the question, the first thing that I wrote was nonfiction. It was supposed to be fiction, but it was an incident that happened with my sisters when we were 8, 9, and 10. And when I told it, it just sounded very fantastical because my worldview tends to be very, it's not fantastical, but like I see the world as a magical place, and that comes through very clearly when I'm just describing something. It just is how I am. So the stories that I was writing were just naturally read as fantasy. They were called fantasy by other students and my professors, all of that. So eventually that was kind of applied to what I was writing. And then at some point, I started playing around with that label and kind of, taking the non-made up things and blending them with the fantasy and doing things. So that's how that happened. It wasn't something where I was thinking, oh, I'm writing fantasy, so let me write this thing. It was more like I'm writing this thing and other people labeled what I was writing. The science fictional aspect came later. It came as I grew older. The many trips that I was taking to Nigeria. As I got older, I started noticing technology and all of that. And I started seeing how it was manifesting itself within tradition and cultural settings in this comfortable way. I started noticing that, and I'm like, no one's writing that. They're writing like about an Africa that people leave, or Africa as a country, and I wanted to see what I was seeing in science fiction. And I also started imagining, okay, so I'm seeing this kind of technology here, like I'm seeing palm wine tappers in the trees with cell phones. What's the future going to look like? I started imagining the future, and that's kind of what led me to writing science fiction. So it wasn't like I was thinking about these labels. It was just something that eventually kind of, one, was applied to what I was writing, and two, it followed me. Like those labels followed me as opposed to me following them.
Here's a related question. Are the worlds you've made, like Akata Witch, Who Fears Death, The Book of Phoenix, Binti, different worlds or the same world in different times?
Some of them are the same, and let me see if I can remember these things. Binti, Lagoon, LaGuardia are all in the same universe. Who Fears Death, Book of Phoenix, and I think, Akata Witch are in the same universe. So, like, most of my books are connected. Almost all of them are connected, but there are different ones. I have a whole chart at home of this. Like, I had to write it down and show, okay, this universe is, these books are from this universe, and these ones are from these. So, yeah, it's a lot.
These worlds always existed in you, or have you invented them?
I'd say they existed before me. Yeah.
Awesome.
Right.
Here's a serious question, but it's a good Berkeley question. How can science fiction address class struggle and maybe even other kinds of struggle, I would add, without aestheticizing it, without repeating stereotypes, without reinforcing the structures it tries to critique? Also, there's many asterisks, beauty standards, and also this question, the questioner thinks, and I think it's likely true too, how does this relate to the way in which you write from a subjective point of view, an I versus a kind of omniscient point of view?
Wait, that's a lot.
That is a lot.
I can address the first part of it is when when it's done well. You know, science fiction, like any other type of literature, requires whatever I'm going to say. It requires the writer to have a sense of responsibility and knowledge, and so I can't remember all of the aspects of it. It was a beauty myth, and there was.
Well, yeah, I can feed you the. There was class and the sort of the nature of class and power, and then its relationship to beauty, and then to subjectivity.
Right, without resorting to stereotypes.
All those things can need. Those are things. That's more of a question of good writing versus not so good writing. Yeah. Those things can be addressed, certainly. How does science fiction address those things in different ways depending on the narrative? There are different types of science fiction. There are many kinds of science fiction, and yeah, when it's done well, those things can be addressed. Of course, those things. Not every book is going to address every single one of those issues, but it is, it can be addressed in science fiction when it's done well.
I'm going to turn to something else, which at least I think is political, which is a question about technology. Mm-hmm. And what is the question I would like you to talk a little bit more about the role or meaning you give to technology itself in your writing, and to the larger question of whether science fiction is always inherently related to technology or not.
The second part, science fiction isn't always related to technology. There's social science fiction. Mm-hmm. Unless you see social constructs as a science, which they kind of are. So there. So yeah, I mean there are different types of science fiction. It's not always obsessed with technology, but there is science fiction that is obsessed with it. I don't like to get mired in definitions. That's like the last thing that I like to spend a lot of energy on. Why? Because you can always find exceptions to the rule, and definitions are fluid. They kind of they can shapeshift and change, but we know what they are. Just like the question about what's the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Do we really want to go down that rabbit hole? Yeah. Even though there are narratives where it's fantasy and when it's science fiction. Are you going to call Game of Thrones science fiction? No. So there are things that but you could say Star Wars is both. There are gray areas. But there is a difference. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. Yeah.
More easy questions. Do you believe in the soul?
Wow. Okay.
Related to the question, I think wants it to relate it to the idea of consciousness, which also relates.
Depends on the day. Okay. But I'd say most days I do. Okay. Most days I do, but there are days where I flirt with the idea of that I don't. Right. I'm willing to look at that, and it's a scary thing to look at. But yes.
Well, then this is a very related question that follows. What keeps you motivated?
I don't know. I mean, it's not something that I think about. Yeah. I'm always motivated. I'm always interested. There are always stories to tell. Maybe that there are always stories to tell. There are always things going on. I am excited about life. I'm excited about everything around me. I look at the world with the eyes of someone who has maintained and nurtured her sense of wonder. I still, an example, I just got a cat. I'm fascinated by this freaking cat. Just utterly fascinated by it. I know there are people who have cats all over the place, but I'm fascinated by this cat.
Are aliens?
They really are.
Yeah. That's quite true.
And they have spaceships, but they hide them. We just don't know where they are.
Yep. It is a scientific fact.
What does your sequel to District 9 look like?
Ooh. Oh, hey, good question. Yeah.
There is no sequel to
Okay.
District 9.
Looks like nothing.
The void.
Very good. What is your favorite book of your own?
It always comes down to the same one, even though it seems trivial. And so I'm just gonna. It is what it is. It's a Stephen King book. It's my favorite book. It's between that and Wild Seed, but like, The Talisman by Stephen King. I read that at the age of 12. The main character was 12. There's something magical about that narrative, and I keep coming back to it. It may be a trivial, very cliche story, but there's something. I think I just read it at a pivotal time, and it locked in. And so I always come back. To that story. It just, yeah. So,
What about it?
The hero's journey.
Yeah.
This journey over, and it's between worlds.
Yeah.
And he's jumping between. It's one of those stories where, and I love stories that are magical, but they remain rooted in our world. I love that. That's just there's just something about that. And so we have this main character who has to go across the United States back to, I think it's somewhere in California, Alhambra, something. Yeah, I think Alhambra. Yeah. But and he has to travel on foot, no technology. He can't go in an airplane. He can't, and it's this 12-year-old boy. He travels and he has to go between worlds, flipping while something is pursuing him. And I love that. There's a serious magical Negro in that narrative. I just feel like I have to say that. He's a problem.
Yeah.
It is Stephen King.
It is Stephen King. But yeah, that one, yeah.
Well, that actually, both parts of your answer there also relate to, I think, another really great but difficult question, which is the question of your own roots and identity as both African and African American, and how going between those identities and worlds relates to your writing and relates into what you clearly have been able to do successfully, which is both not fitting in but being yourself unapologetically.
Yeah, that's one of the deepest foundations of everything that I write. That duality. Growing up, I grew up mainly in the south suburbs of Chicago, in a suburb called South Holland, Illinois. It was extremely racist. I mean, it was like the 60s there. And I mean, I heard the N-word every day. We were chased. We had paint thrown in our pool. We had hate letters. The teachers would say things. So I grew up with that. And I had parents who were immigrants from Nigeria. They saw this place, and we moved there because they saw a quaint little town, and they didn't have the lens of an African American. So if an African American had looked at this town, they would have known, oh, we know what that is. My parents did not know. And so we moved there, and so we dealt with all of that, deep, right, like a very American experience. So while that was happening, my parents were taking us back to Nigeria, an all-black country where we had relatives there, and we met our relatives, and we ran wild with our cousins and in the bushes, and had all these really deep cultural experiences. Understood our heritage, understood that we were Igbo, and this is what it means, and masquerades, and learning bits of Igbo, all of that. And then we'd come back to South Holland, Illinois. So already I learned from a young age that the world was a big place. It was
Not
big.
two identities there. It says 7.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was so much, especially for someone who was young. So early on, I was already dialoguing with these ideas. I was already asking the questions. When in Nigeria, we'd be called the American Nigerians, and we'd be made fun of because of our accents and all of that. And so I already was having those conversations with cousins. Why are you saying that? This is how I sound, and all of that. And then in the United States, growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and then moving and then meeting African Americans who then viewed us as white. So it was all very, I learned what Oreo meant. It was very confusing for a little while. But like I was in dialogue with these things from very early on. And it wasn't just that I was passive about it. I didn't let it just happen to me. I didn't let any of these conflicts cause me to hate myself. I never wanted to be white, never in my life. I knew what my name meant. I knew how to pronounce my name. I will correct you in the pronunciation of my name, all those things. So like that was very strong in me from a young age. So once I started writing, it naturally came up. It naturally came through this idea of moving across boundaries, and being comfortable and carrying everything that was me over the boundary and moving forth with that. So all of that really, like in almost all of the stories that I've read, you can see how that has manifested itself or how that conversation comes forth.
Yeah.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much. I think this is going to be our last question. It's a good one to end on. I would say two things before I ask the last question. First of all, if all of this has inspired you to buy every single one of Nnedi's books, we will give you that opportunity tonight. There is going to be a book sale and signing outdoors afterwards. And I would ask, we'd like to get Nnedi out there and into her well-deserved bed/drink, whatever she has planned after this. So if you have a question for her afterwards, buy a book and you'll get to answer it at the signing. And then secondly, I realize in my enthusiasm at the very beginning, I also forgot to thank our sponsors here tonight, Arts and Design Mondays, who pip Shannon Jackson and her team, including Massimo Piacconi, who's here tonight. They pay the rent for the BAM PFA, and we're very grateful to them for that. I will ask Nnedi as our last question tonight on behalf of all of us, what can we do today to make the hope and choices in your science fiction stories become a part of our possible future?
That's huge. What can we do today? I'm always, I always encourage open understanding and dialogue, like true and listening. Knowing when to listen, because listening is something that's very underrated in my opinion. It's like if there is a conversation happening, like, and it makes you feel a certain way, just stop and listen first. Listen and consider before entering that dialogue, because there are a lot of issues that are being discussed right now. And they're painful issues. And I think that listening is something that more of us need to do. So I think listening and considering and kind of calming that need to talk back immediately is a useful tool right now.
Very good note to end on. Please join me in thanking Donna Jones, Nnedi Okorafor.